Hi guys, tonight we're drifting gently into the quiet, steady life of a man whose calm ideas shook the entire world. This is the story of Alfred Wegener, the scientist who dared to believe that continents could move long before anyone else accepted such a thought. In the next moments, we'll slowly step into the early chapters of his life, following the small details that shaped a mind capable of shifting the ground beneath our feet. Here, in this calm retelling, you'll feel how one quiet question can change everything. But before we begin, for those who enjoy slow, thoughtful stories about legendary figures, hit like, subscribe and share in the comments which personality or historical figure you'd like me to cover next. And tell me, where are you watching from? I'm always curious to see the different places my viewers are from. Alfred Wegener was born in Berlin in 1880, in a world that felt solid, fixed and unchanging. The idea that the earth beneath us could drift like silent islands on a vast ocean was something few could even imagine. But Wegener's mind was drawn to patterns, shapes that matched, coastlines that seemed to whisper old memories, and small clues that refused to leave him alone. His childhood was simple, quiet, and shaped by long walks with his curiosity as his closest companion. He grew up in a family of scholars, surrounded by books, maps, and thoughtful conversations. The atmosphere was gentle, stable, and filled with the kind of intellectual warmth that encourages a child to look closer at the world. His father, a classical languages teacher, never pushed him toward any specific direction. Instead, he let Alfred find his own rhythm. And that rhythm was steady, patient, and deeply observant. As a young boy, Alfred would trace coastlines in atlases, noticing small shapes that seemed to belong together. The eastern curve of South America matched the western edge of Africa almost perfectly. It was a simple detail, something countless people had seen before, but Alfred felt a quiet pull toward it. He wondered in his soft, private way whether those lines meant something more. His school years were calm, steady, marked by a love for geography, astronomy, and the gentle unravelling of natural mysteries. He wasn't the loudest student or the boldest. He was the one who listened, observed, and thoughtfully pieced together information like someone solving a silent puzzle. When he grew older, he entered the University of Berlin, where the world expanded into wider halls of knowledge. He studied physics, meteorology, and astronomy, disciplines that helped him understand the Earth not as a static place, but as a moving system full of forces and flows. Even then, he preferred long evenings alone, reading quietly, connecting ideas in ways that others didn't yet see. His love for the natural world wasn't loud or dramatic, it was steady, and that steadiness would one day give birth to a theory so bold it would shake the foundations of science. But for now, Alfred was just a young man, gently collecting thoughts that would later move continents. Alfred Wegener's early academic years moved quietly, shaped by a calm curiosity that grew stronger with every course he completed. In Berlin, he drifted between lectures on astronomy and meteorology, finding comfort in subjects that explained the world through patterns rather than noise. He wasn't the kind of student who sought attention. His presence was subtle, almost hidden, but his mind worked constantly in the background. During long afternoons in the university libraries, he explored old maps, charts, and early geological sketches that attempted to describe the Earth's surface. Most people saw these documents as simple tools, but Alfred viewed them as clues to a deeper story. He noticed the same familiar shapes he had traced as a child, coastlines that mirrored each other, rock formations described in different continents that seemed strangely similar, and fossil evidence that hinted at connections across oceans that should have been impossible. At the time, the scientific world believed the continents were fixed in place. The Earth's surface, they thought, was solid and unchanging. Oceans and mountains were permanent, and the idea of drifting land masses felt almost absurd. Alfred didn't challenge this openly. Instead, he observed quietly, storing each detail in his mind. He was patient with his own ideas, allowing them to mature slowly rather than force them into premature theories. As he completed his studies, meteorology began to pull him in more strongly. The movement of air, the flow of weather systems, the gentle shifting of seasons, all of these fascinated him. He felt that understanding the sky somehow helped him understand the ground as well. The earth, he believed, was not static. It breathed, changed and moved in ways that many hadn't yet recognized. After earning his doctorate, he accepted a position at a meteorological observatory. The work suited him perfectly. Days passed in quiet routines, measuring winds, tracking cloud formations, recording temperature shifts, and analyzing seasonal behaviors. The steady rhythm gave him time to think, and in those soft stretches of silence, his mind returned again and again to the mysterious shape of continents. In the small moments between observations, he continued sketching coastlines side by side, imagining how they might have once formed a single landmass. He didn't yet have enough evidence, and he knew the scientific community would never accept a theory built on intuition alone. So he kept watching, waiting, gathering small pieces of information as if he were assembling a puzzle without knowing the final image. His colleagues viewed him as diligent and calm, someone reliable in both work and temperament. Few realized he was slowly building the foundation for a revolutionary idea. For Alfred, these years were not rushed. They were quiet, thoughtful, and filled with a gentle conviction that the earth held a secret, one he was determined to uncover, no matter how slowly the truth revealed itself. Alfred Wegener's life took a quiet but meaningful turn when he discovered his second great passion, exploration. While meteorology kept him grounded in daily observation, the idea of travelling into the unknown felt like the natural extension of his curiosity. He wasn't driven by adventure in the dramatic sense. Instead, he felt a calm need to understand the world by standing directly in the places where nature revealed itself with the most clarity. In the early 1900s, polar research was becoming a growing field, and many scientists were drawn to the icy expanses of Greenland. For Alfred, the Arctic represented something different. It was a place where the atmosphere, the ground, and the forces of nature moved freely and openly, unhidden by cities or noise. The stillness of the ice, the slow shifting of frozen landscapes, and the endless horizon made it the perfect place to observe the Earth's natural rhythms. When he received the opportunity to join an expedition to Greenland, he accepted without hesitation. His colleagues admired his dedication, though some quietly wondered why someone so gentle, so reserved, would volunteer for such harsh conditions. But Alfred felt at peace with the decision. He believed that to truly understand the world, he had to witness its extremes. The journey north was long and cold, filled with quiet days on the ship as it cut through frozen waters. Alfred spent those hours reading, writing, and watching the sky. The Arctic weather fascinated him. Sudden winds, shifting patterns of light, the subtle changes in temperature that signalled storms long before they appeared. When the expedition finally reached Greenland, Alfred was struck by the overwhelming silence. The landscape felt ancient, untouched, and pure. He recorded every detail with patient care: the movement of glaciers, the behaviour of the wind, the stability of ice structures. His instruments were simple, yet he used them with such precision that his observations later became invaluable to meteorology. Despite the freezing temperatures, the isolation, and the slow pace of life in the Arctic, Alfred felt deeply calm there. Each day offered a new pattern to observe, a new clue about the Earth's shifting systems. He grew more confident in his ability to understand natural forces, and with each quiet evening spent writing in his logbooks, he sensed that all his studies, physics, astronomy, meteorology, geology, were slowly converging into something larger. He didn't yet know that these experiences would later help shape one of the most argued over theories in modern science. For now, the Arctic simply became a place where his thoughts settled into clarity, and where the early pieces of his future discoveries began to take shape. Alfred Wegener returned from his first Greenland expedition changed in a quiet but unmistakable way. The Arctic had given him something he didn't fully understand yet: a sense that the world was far more dynamic than most scientists believed. The silent movement of ice, the slow shifting of glaciers, and the patterns of wind that flowed with almost musical rhythm all left him with a deeper respect for the Earth as a living, changing system. Back in Europe, he resumed his work in meteorology with steady discipline. But something in him felt different. His observations became more detailed, his questions more daring, and his curiosity more focused. He noticed small things others overlooked, unusual similarities in rock layers across distant continents, identical fossil species separated by vast oceans, and ancient climate patterns that made little sense if the Earth's surface had always remained fixed. He didn't voice these thoughts yet. The scientific community was firmly rooted in the belief that continents were immovable. The idea that land masses could drift across the Earth seemed almost unscientific, something closer to imagination than evidence. Still, Wegener kept collecting quiet clues. During calm evenings in his study, he compared geological maps from South America and Africa, tracing their coastlines with a soft pencil. Each time, the fit was undeniable. It wasn't perfect, but it was too precise to be coincidence. He read through old geological records, noting descriptions of identical rocks found on opposite sides of the Atlantic. He studied fossil reports of ancient plants, whose seeds were too heavy to drift across oceans. Everything pointed to a simple yet extraordinary possibility. The continents had once been connected. In these moments, Alfred felt both excitement and caution. He knew that ideas alone were not enough. Science required evidence, structure, and patience. So he didn't rush to form conclusions. Instead, he created folders for each observation and added notes slowly, building a foundation as steady as the glaciers he had studied. At the same time, Wegener began teaching at various universities, finding comfort in the predictable rhythm of academic life. His lectures were calm and carefully structured, guided by a desire to make complex ideas feel simple and intuitive. Students appreciated his quiet approach. He never tried to impress them with dramatic statements. He simply shared what he found beautiful about the world. During this period, he also deepened his research in climatology. He studied ancient climate zones, analysing how they shifted over millions of years. These patterns, he noticed, only made sense if continents had moved from one climate region to another. Once again, the evidence whispered the same message. The Earth's surface was not fixed. The idea stayed with him everywhere, during train rides, in lecture halls, and even in the stillness of early mornings before work. Sometimes he would pause, look at a map, and feel a quiet certainty settle over him. He knew he was moving toward a theory that would challenge the foundations of geology. He didn't know when he would be ready to share it, but he felt the moment approaching slowly, like a tide rising in silence. For now, he allowed the idea to grow gently, guided by patience and the deep, steady belief that the Earth was telling him a story, one he was meant to uncover piece by piece. As Alfred Wegener continued gathering clues, his life moved with the same steady rhythm that had shaped his childhood curiosity. Yet beneath that calm surface, something profound was forming, an idea that refused to stay quiet. Each evening, after finishing his lectures and meteorological reports, he would return home, light a small lamp on his desk, and spread out maps across the table. The coastlines of continents seemed to draw him in like a gentle puzzle waiting to be solved. He studied South America and Africa most often, slowly tracing their edges until the lines felt familiar, almost personal. The fit between them felt too smooth, too natural to ignore. But Wegener knew that matching coastlines alone would never convince the scientific world. He needed weightier evidence, so he immersed himself in geology, paleontology, and early climatology papers. These weren't his primary fields, but his mind worked comfortably across disciplines, weaving observations together into a single picture. The more he read, the more convinced he became that the continents had once been part of a larger landmass that later broke apart. Fossil records fascinated him deeply. He learned of the ancient fern Glossopteris, whose remains were found in South America, Africa, India, Antarctica, and Australia. Continents separated by thousands of miles of open ocean. The seeds of this plant were too heavy to travel long distances, making their widespread presence nearly impossible under traditional explanations. Then there were the identical reptile fossils discovered on both sides of the Atlantic, creatures that couldn't have swum such vast distances. Wegener found these details comforting in a quiet, almost reassuring way, as if nature itself was offering breadcrumbs toward the truth. He took notes slowly, labelling each observation with precise handwriting. His mind worked like a gentle tide, collecting evidence layer by layer until patterns emerged with undeniable clarity. Still, he remained cautious. He feared that speaking too soon would bring unnecessary criticism and distract him from the work still left to do. During this period, his personal life also shifted softly into a new chapter. He met Elsa Köppen, the daughter of his mentor and friend, the renowned climatologist Vladimir Köppen. Elsa was warm, thoughtful, and steady, qualities that balanced Alfred's reserved nature. Their relationship grew quietly, grounded in mutual respect and shared fascination with science. They married in 1913, beginning a calm domestic life filled with long conversations, late-night reading, and a shared appreciation for the simplicity of everyday routines. Living in a home surrounded by scientific minds gave Alfred additional support and encouragement. Vladimir Köppen, wise and experienced, became both a father figure and a collaborator, offering advice that helped Alfred refine his approach to research. Together they discussed climate patterns, past environmental changes and geological formations, all of which gently strengthened Alfred's developing theory. Even though he now had a family and teaching responsibilities, the idea of drifting continents followed him everywhere. He thought about it during walks home, during quiet dinners, even during moments spent rocking his infant daughter to sleep. The theory was no longer just a scientific curiosity. It had become a soft but constant presence in his life, urging him forward. Wegener didn't yet know that soon he would gather the courage to present his idea to the world, and that the world would not be ready for it. By 1914, Alfred Wegener felt the quiet pressure of an idea that had grown too large to keep contained. For years he had collected fragments of evidence, matching fossils, mirrored coastlines, ancient climate zones, and geological formations that seemed to stretch across oceans. Each clue whispered the same possibility, and though he moved through life with his usual calmness, he knew the moment was approaching when he would have to share his theory with the scientific world. Still, Wegener was not impulsive. He prepared slowly, thoughtfully, almost delicately. While many scientists built their reputations on bold announcements, Alfred preferred to understand every detail before speaking a single word. So he organized his findings into careful sections, comparing data from different continents, reading geological papers late into the night, and discussing climate patterns with Vladimir Köppen during long, gentle walks. His living room slowly transformed into a landscape of maps, charts, and notebooks. Elsa sometimes peeked in and smiled quietly. She understood that her husband was building something important, even if she didn't yet know what form it would take. Alfred worked with the steady patience of someone who genuinely loved the process of discovery. And then, unexpectedly, the world changed. War broke out across Europe. Daily routines dissolved into uncertainty, and like many men of his time, Alfred was called to serve. His expertise in meteorology made him valuable to the military, and he was assigned to weather observation tasks rather than the front lines. It was a quiet role within a very loud conflict, and the contrast felt surreal. While artillery thundered miles away, he spent his days measuring winds and tracking atmospheric shifts, the same gentle tasks that had shaped his academic life. But even in wartime, the idea of drifting continents stayed with him. During rare moments of calm, he would sit alone with a notebook and refine the core of his theory. The discipline of quiet thinking helped him cope with the chaos around him. It became a kind of refuge, a place where logic and nature still made sense. When the war finally ended, Wegener returned home with a deep longing for normalcy. Elsa and their children welcomed him back into a home filled with warmth and stability, yet he quickly realised that the world of science had also shifted during those years. New discoveries had surfaced, new research had been published, and he sensed that the time had finally come to share what he had been building. In 1915, in the brief pause before his next military assignment, Alfred completed the first edition of his book, The Origin of Continents and Oceans. He wrote it with remarkable calmness, as if explaining the idea to a friend rather than challenging the foundations of geology. The tone was gentle, logical, almost soothing. He presented his evidence step by step, never demanding belief, only inviting readers to consider a possibility that connected countless geological puzzles. The continents had once formed a single supercontinent that later drifted apart. He called this ancient landmass Pangaea. Wegener felt a soft sense of relief when the book was finished. For years the idea had lived quietly inside him, but now it had taken shape in the outside world. He knew that reactions would come, some curious, some sceptical, some harsh, but he felt ready. The continents had moved long before humans walked the earth, and the truth would not vanish simply because it was difficult to accept. For Alfred, publishing the theory was not an act of defiance. It was an act of gentle honesty, the natural next step for a man who had spent his life listening to the subtle patterns of the world. When Alfred Wegener finally released his book to the world, he did so with a sense of calm anticipation, not triumph. He wasn't trying to overturn geology, challenge authority, or shock anyone. He simply wanted to share a pattern he had seen, a pattern that felt too clear to ignore. But once the book reached the hands of geologists, paleontologists, and scholars, the response was far colder than he expected. His colleagues in meteorology were polite, curious, even supportive. They admired his ability to connect climate data with geological clues. But geologists, who had spent decades building theories on the idea of a fixed Earth, reacted with skepticism. Many dismissed the theory immediately, calling it imaginative but unscientific. They argued that continents could not possibly move. The Earth's crust was solid, and there was no known force strong enough to push entire land masses across the globe. Others said the matching coastlines were a coincidence, nothing more. A few even mocked the idea openly, describing it as a fantasy or daydream disguised as science. Wegener read these critiques quietly, sitting at his desk in the same soft lamplight where he had shaped the theory. The words stung, of course, not because he expected praise, but because he believed so deeply in the evidence. Yet he didn't respond with anger or bitterness. Instead, he reread the critiques carefully, noting the points he needed to address. He understood that scientific progress required patience, and he never saw disagreement as a personal attack. The lack of geological support frustrated him, but he remained steady. He trusted that the Earth held the truth, and in time, the truth would speak for itself. Despite the criticism, small pockets of interest began to form. A few younger scientists found the idea intriguing and worth exploring. They wrote to Wegener with questions, observations, and encouragement. These letters became a quiet source of comfort for him. They reminded him that every new idea in science begins as an outsider before it becomes a foundation. As the years passed, Alfred refined his arguments. He gathered additional fossil evidence, expanded his work on ancient climate zones, and explained continental drift with even clearer logic. Still, the same obstacle remained. No one knew what force could move continents. Without a mechanism, many scientists refused to consider the theory seriously. Wegener admitted he didn't yet have the answer, but he insisted that the lack of a known mechanism did not invalidate the evidence. Nature didn't wait for human understanding before shaping the world. Meanwhile, life at home remained peaceful. Elsa supported him through every wave of criticism, listening patiently as he explained new findings or read aloud the latest responses from the scientific community. Their home was warm, filled with gentle conversations and the predictable routines of family life. It balanced the uncertainty of his research perfectly. During quieter nights, Wegener sometimes wondered whether his theory would ever be accepted. He imagined future scientists looking back, perhaps seeing what he saw, perhaps even building upon it. That thought gave him comfort. He didn't need recognition in his lifetime. He simply wanted the idea to survive long enough for someone else to carry it forward, and deep down, he felt certain that one day, someone would. As the years moved quietly forward, Alfred Wegener continued refining his theory with a kind of gentle persistence that defined both his personality and his scientific approach. He never rushed, never forced conclusions, and never responded sharply to critics. Instead, he chose to strengthen the foundation of his work one patient step at a time. While many scientists dismissed his ideas, he found comfort in the clarity of his own observations. He trusted evidence more than opinion, and he believed that nature would eventually reveal what needed to be understood. In 1922, he released a second edition of The Origin of Continents and Oceans, expanding the sections on fossil distribution, geological formations, and ancient climate zones. The additional data made his argument stronger, more structured, and more accessible. Yet even with these improvements, the scientific world remained cautious. Most geologists still believed the Earth's crust was fixed and immovable. Wegener understood that he was asking them to rethink ideas that had guided their entire careers. Change in science often came slowly, and he accepted that with patient resolve. During this period, he balanced his research with a full academic schedule. He lectured on meteorology, geophysics, and climatology, guiding students through the quiet beauty of atmospheric patterns and the logic hidden within natural systems. His students appreciated his calm voice and the clarity of his explanations. Many later wrote that his classes felt less like lectures and more like thoughtful conversations about the world. His teaching style reflected his personality, gentle, steady, and deeply observant. At home, family life brought warmth to his otherwise demanding days. Elsa created an atmosphere that felt peaceful and grounding, a place where Alfred could return after long hours of study. Their children added laughter to the quiet rooms, and even though Alfred was naturally reserved, he cherished these moments of closeness. He spent evenings reading stories, helping with homework, or simply enjoying the softness of domestic life. Yet even in these peaceful hours, his mind drifted often to the continents, to their shapes, their histories, and the silent journey they might have taken across the earth. When the nights were especially still, he would sketch new diagrams or compare geological notes from different regions. He never allowed the theory to dominate his life, but it remained a constant presence, like a gentle thought that followed him everywhere. By the mid-1920s, Wegener began revisiting Greenland, drawn again to the Arctic atmosphere that had shaped his earlier insights. The cold, the silence, and the wide horizon gave him a sense of clarity he couldn't find anywhere else. He worked closely with fellow scientists, studying atmospheric circulation, tracking weather patterns, and observing the behavior of glaciers. These expeditions were difficult. Harsh winds, long nights, limited supplies, yet Wegener felt comfortable in the challenge. The Arctic appealed to him because it was honest. There were no distractions, no unnecessary noise, only the raw rhythm of the earth, and in that rhythm, he sensed truths that felt essential. During these journeys, his belief in continental drift grew even stronger. He saw how natural forces could shape and move landscapes over time. He felt the weight of glaciers shifting beneath his feet and watched ice flow with slow, deliberate power. These observations didn't solve the mystery of what moved continents, but they deepened his conviction that movement was possible. As he worked, Wegener didn't assume he would live to see his theory accepted. He simply hoped that future scientists would find the courage to look beyond established ideas. He believed that truth didn't disappear just because it was inconvenient. It waited quietly for the right moment to be understood. And somewhere in the stillness of Greenland's frozen air, Wegener felt that moment drawing closer, even if it remained far beyond the horizon. By the late 1920s, Alfred Wegener had become a figure both admired and doubted, respected for his work in meteorology, yet questioned for his theory of drifting continents. Still, he continued forward with the same calm determination that had carried him through years of study, criticism, and long expeditions. He was never discouraged by resistance. Instead, he treated every challenge as another quiet opportunity to refine his understanding of the Earth. During these years, his focus on Greenland deepened. He joined several expeditions, each one pushing farther into the icy interior than the last. The conditions were harsh. Temperatures dropped dangerously low, storms formed without warning, and the isolation was intense. But Wegener seemed to find a strange sense of peace in this environment. The Arctic, with its silent stretches of snow and endless white horizons, offered him the clarity and stillness he needed to think. These expeditions were not only scientific but also logistical challenges. Teams had to transport supplies across vast distances, build temporary shelters, and maintain communication in a landscape that resisted all human effort. Wegener took on these tasks with steady focus. He believed deeply in the value of polar research, especially for meteorology. Understanding Greenland's weather patterns, ice sheets, and atmospheric behaviour could help improve predictions across Europe. And quietly, beneath these official goals, the Arctic reminded him that the Earth was never as static as people believed. On the ice, he observed the slow, powerful movement of glaciers. He felt the ground shift beneath layers of snow and heard distant cracks echo through frozen valleys. These experiences strengthened his conviction that continents too could move, not quickly, not dramatically, but slowly, over immense stretches of time. Back in Germany, Wegener continued improving his book. Each new edition became more detailed, more precise, incorporating the latest research and responding thoughtfully to criticism. He never argued aggressively. Instead, he offered explanations with gentle clarity, inviting scientists to look at the evidence with fresh eyes. A few began to listen, not many, but enough that Wegener felt encouraged. Younger geologists especially found his ideas intriguing. They recognized that science had changed before, often in ways that seemed impossible at first. His lectures attracted growing interest. Students described the quiet intensity in his voice when he talked about ancient climates, matching fossils or coastlines that fit like puzzle pieces. He never sensationalized his theory. He presented it simply, letting the logic speak for itself. Meanwhile, his family provided a steady sense of balance. Elsa managed the household with warmth and patience, understanding the importance of her husband's work even when he was gone for months at a time. Their children grew up surrounded by maps, notebooks, and stories of distant ice fields. Wegener was not a dramatic or emotional father, but he was gentle and attentive in his own quiet way. As the decade drew on, he sensed that he was approaching another crossroads. Greenland was calling again, a new expedition, more ambitious than the previous ones, aimed at establishing year-round scientific stations deep within the ice. It would be demanding, dangerous, and unpredictable. But Alfred felt a calm pull toward it. He believed the Arctic still had truths to reveal, and he was ready to listen. Even if the world had not yet embraced his ideas, he trusted time. Time, he believed, would move everything, even continents, into their rightful place. As preparations for the next Greenland expedition began, Alfred Wegener approached the task with his usual quiet discipline. This journey, planned for 1930, was meant to be the most ambitious one yet, a long-term scientific mission deep within the ice, where researchers would spend an entire year studying weather patterns, glacier movement, and atmospheric behaviour. For Wegener, it wasn't simply another field trip. It felt like the natural continuation of everything he had been working toward. The Arctic had shaped his scientific thinking for decades, and returning there brought him a sense of clarity he couldn't find anywhere else. The planning process was demanding. Supplies had to be calculated with precision. Food, fuel, clothing, instruments, dogs, sledges, tents, and emergency reserves. The team needed enough resources to survive months of isolation, where storms could cut off all communication and temperatures could fall to levels few people had ever experienced. Wegener reviewed every detail with patient care. Even though he wasn't the official leader of the entire expedition, he took responsibility for many organisational tasks, wanting everything to run smoothly for the men who would face the unforgiving ice. At home, Elsa watched him prepare with a mixture of pride and concern. She understood his connection to Greenland, but the risks were undeniable. The Arctic could be unpredictable, and the goal of building a permanent station far inland pushed the limits of what even experienced explorers could handle. Still, she supported him, offering quiet encouragement as he packed instruments and reviewed maps late into the evening. Wegener approached the mission with calm confidence. He believed the data collected there would help refine weather forecasting and deepen scientific understanding of the Earth's atmosphere. And in his own mind, he sensed that further observations of ice movement might continue to support his theory of continental drift, even if indirectly. His previous expeditions had shown him how landscapes could shift over time, how ice flowed slowly yet powerfully, and how natural forces worked on scales far larger than a human lifetime. Before leaving, he spent extra time with his children, promising to write whenever possible. He wasn't a man of dramatic goodbyes. His affection appeared in soft gestures, quiet discussions, and a gentle steadiness that reassured his family. When the day finally arrived, Wegener departed with a calm heart. The ship carrying the team moved northward through cold waters, breaking slowly through ice as the air grew sharper. Alfred spent the voyage preparing notes, checking instruments, and watching the sky, its shifting patterns always giving him a sense of peace. Once they reached Greenland's coast, the familiar silence welcomed him. The crisp wind, the endless white horizon, and the subtle sounds of ice settling beneath the surface felt almost like returning home. Yet this expedition was more complex than the ones before. Establishing a station deep in the ice required crossing difficult terrain, moving tons of supplies, and coordinating teams across long distances. Wegener understood the challenges but trusted in careful planning and the resilience of the men around him. As the first weeks unfolded, the mission progressed steadily, though not without strain. Harsh storms tested their endurance, and the cold made simple tasks exhausting. But Alfred remained calm, encouraging the team with quiet reassurance. In the evenings, he wrote in his journal, noting weather patterns, recording observations, and reflecting on the beauty and danger of the Arctic. He didn't know it yet, but this expedition would become the defining chapter of his life, the place where his dedication, patience, and belief in science would meet their ultimate test. As autumn settled over Greenland's immense ice sheet, the challenges facing the expedition grew heavier with each passing week. The inland station, ice meter, meaning ice centre, had been successfully established far from the coast, but keeping it supplied proved far more difficult than anyone expected. Temperatures dropped faster than planned, storms arrived earlier in the season, and the vast distances between stations stretched the team's strength to its limits. Ice meter was critical to the mission. The scientists stationed there were meant to spend the winter collecting continuous meteorological data, the kind that could only be gathered in complete isolation at the heart of the ice sheet. But for that to happen, they needed enough food, fuel, and equipment to survive months of darkness and cold. Wegener, monitoring the situation from the west station closer to the coast, grew increasingly concerned. Each supply run took longer than the previous one. Crevasses, sudden storms, and exhaustion slowed the sled teams dramatically. Several dogs were already weakened, and some men showed signs of fatigue that could not be ignored. Still, Alfred believed that with careful effort and steady determination, the mission could succeed. He was not reckless. He simply held a quiet confidence in the team's abilities and in the planning they had put into the expedition. But by late October, it became clear that Smita's supplies would not last through the winter unless an additional delivery was made, and quickly. The inland station reported dwindling fuel and dangerously low food reserves. Without a resupply run, the scientists there would be forced to abandon their posts, losing precious months of uninterrupted data collection. Wegener weighed the risks carefully. The winter winds had already begun to howl across the ice, and daylight was shrinking rapidly. Travel would be slow, dangerous, and physically draining. Yet delaying meant certain failure for the mission. Someone had to deliver the supplies. Wegener made the decision to join the resupply journey himself. He wasn't obligated to. He could have ordered younger men to take on the dangerous trek. But leadership, to him, meant sharing the hardship, not assigning it from a place of safety. His calm resolve inspired those around him. Despite exhaustion, several men volunteered to accompany him, trusting his judgment and steady presence. As they prepared to depart, the atmosphere at West Station was a mix of tension and respect. Everyone understood the seriousness of the task, a 200-kilometre journey across unforgiving terrain, with winter closing in around them. Wegener packed lightly but thoughtfully. Notebooks, maps, essential tools, and layers of warm clothing. The dogs were harnessed, sleds loaded with food and fuel, and the team gathered for a final quiet moment before stepping into the icy wilderness. Wegener took a deep breath of the cold air. The Arctic night was beginning to stretch across the sky, the moon casting a pale glow over the frozen world. He felt the familiar calm that always came to him before a difficult task, a sense of clarity, as if the noise of the world disappeared and only purpose remained. With a gentle command to the dogs, Alfred Wegener and his team began their long journey toward Eismeter, unaware that the path ahead would test them in ways none of them could foresee. The journey toward Eismeter began under a sky already shifting toward the long Arctic night. As Wegener and his small team pushed their sleds forward, the cold settled around them with a heaviness that felt almost alive. Winds swept across the snow in long whispering waves, erasing their tracks within minutes. Each day grew shorter than the one before, and every moment of faint daylight had to be used with precision. The sled dogs worked tirelessly, their breaths forming small clouds that drifted into the freezing air. Wegener watched them carefully, knowing that their strength would determine the speed of the entire journey. He encouraged them with soft words rather than shouts. It was his way. Calm, steady, patient, even on the most difficult terrain. At first, the pace remained manageable. The team followed familiar routes Weprecht and others had mapped earlier in the season. But as October deepened, conditions shifted unpredictably. Snowdrifts grew taller, and hidden crevasses forced the men to probe constantly with long poles. Each careful step slowed them, yet rushing was impossible. A single mistake could mean disaster. Wegener felt the weight of responsibility in every decision. Though he had travelled across Greenland many times, this trek carried a different urgency. The men waiting at Eismeter depended entirely on this resupply run. Without fresh food and fuel, their winter research and their safety would collapse. During quiet moments, when the wind calmed and the moon lit the ice with a pale glow, the team continued moving, determined to cover as much distance as possible. Wegener often walked beside the sleds instead of riding them, saving the dogs' strength for the hardest stretches ahead. At night, they built small snow walls to shield their tents from the cold. Inside, wrapped in layers of blankets and furs, the men spoke little. Fatigue ran deep, and the knowledge of the long road ahead weighed on them more heavily than the cold. Wegener used these hours to write short notes in his journal, observations about the weather, the condition of the dogs, and the morale of the team. His handwriting remained steady, even when his hands trembled from the cold. He took comfort in recording details. It gave structure to the silence and reminded him that even in the harshest environment, science could still be practiced. As the days passed, one of the men, Rasmus Willumsen, emerged as Wegener's closest companion on the journey. Strong, experienced, and quietly resilient, Rasmus shared Wegener's calm manner. They often walked side by side, speaking only when necessary, trusting each other's presence without needing many words. By the fourth day, storms had grown fiercer. The wind cut across the ice like a blade, forcing the team to move in short bursts rather than long strides. Snow swirled around them in thick, blinding sheets. Sometimes they could barely see the sleds in front of them. Still, quitting was never an option. The inland station's survival depended on them. Wegener remained steady, guiding the team with a quiet confidence that kept fear at bay. Each night, as the men drifted into uneasy sleep, Alfred lay awake a little longer, listening to the wind press against the tent. He thought of Elsa, of his children, and of the work waiting at Eismiete. Despite the hardship, he felt a strange sense of peace. This journey, as dangerous as it was, aligned perfectly with the life he had chosen, one dedicated to understanding the earth, no matter how great the distance or how harsh the conditions. The Arctic demanded respect, patience, and endurance, and Wegener, in his quiet way, possessed all three. As Wegener's team continued deeper into the ice, the landscape transformed into a vast, silent world of white and shadow. The horizon disappeared into a blur of blowing snow, and the temperature fell so sharply that even breathing felt heavier. Each movement required effort. Each decision had to be made with precision. The Arctic, which had always felt like a place of clarity for Wegener, now revealed its most unforgiving side. The men moved slowly, guiding the dogs through terrain that shifted beneath them. Snow concealed deep fractures in the ice, and the team often had to stop to probe the ground before taking another step. The dogs sensed the danger too. Their ears twitched with every subtle sound beneath the surface. Despite the harshness, they pressed on, driven by Wegener's quiet conviction. He never raised his voice, never allowed fear to take root. His calm surrounded the team like a shield, helping them trust that the journey, however difficult, still had purpose. By the seventh day, exhaustion began to show. The cold drained their strength, and the men struggled to rest between supply-packed sleds and flapping tent walls. Food had to be rationed carefully. Even melting snow for drinking water took time and precious fuel. Yet Wegener remained steady. In the evenings he reviewed their route, measuring distance left to Eismiete. They were behind schedule, but not dangerously so, at least not yet. Willemsen stayed closest to Wegener, checking the dogs each morning and helping distribute loads across the sleds. Their partnership grew stronger as the conditions worsened. A few times, when storms forced the team to halt completely, Wegener and Rasmus stood outside together, shielding their faces from the icy wind while assessing whether progress was possible. They often chose to wait, knowing that pushing forward blindly would put everyone at risk. On the 9th day, the weather shifted again. The wind softened, leaving the air eerily still. The sky opened, revealing a pale sun glimmering weakly through thin clouds. It was the first sign of relief in many days, and the team took advantage, covering more distance in a single stretch than they had managed in the previous 48 hours. Still, the cold deepened. Temperatures dropped to levels that made metal crack and fabric freeze solid within minutes. Their breath turned into crystals that clung to their scarves. Every hour felt longer than the one before. Wegener's hands stiffened, but he continued writing short notes in his journal whenever they paused, capturing observations with remarkable focus. He recorded air pressure, wind direction, and snow density, details valuable to meteorology, even in hardship. Quietly, he also tracked the condition of each man. Leadership, to him, meant attention. As the team neared Eismiete, the landscape became more treacherous. The inland ice rose gently, forming broad, hidden ridges shaped by centuries of frozen wind. The dogs grew restless. They recognized the strain of climbing through deeper snow. But Wegener pushed on with careful determination. He believed they were close, perhaps only a day or two away. And despite the cold, despite the endless white stretching all around them, he felt a faint, growing sense of hope. The hardest part of the journey wasn't over, but the purpose that had driven him across these frozen miles felt stronger than ever. The men at Eismiete were waiting, and Wegener intended to reach them. By the time Wegener's team reached the 12th day of travel, The Arctic had become a world of monotony and danger, a place where every sound, every shift of wind carried meaning. The cold settled into their bones so deeply that even layers of fur and wool could not fully protect them. Yet still they moved forward, guided by the quiet urgency that had fueled the entire mission. The men at Ismita depended on them. Progress slowed once again as the terrain grew harsher. The inland ice sheet rose into gentle but relentless slopes, forcing the sled dogs to pull with every ounce of strength they still possessed. Wegener walked beside the lead sled, one hand on the rope, whispering encouragement to the animals who strained against the icy wind. His breath formed white clouds that drifted away into the vast emptiness. The men were tired, more tired than any of them dared to admit aloud, but no one suggested turning back. The idea of stopping, of abandoning their goal, felt heavier than the cold itself. During short breaks, they huddled together around the dim heat of their small stoves, melting snow, eating minimal rations and resting their aching muscles. Conversation grew rare. Words felt unnecessary, almost wasteful. They saved their energy for the only thing that mattered, moving forward. Wegener sensed the physical limits of each man, observing their posture, their pace, the way fatigue showed in their eyes. He adjusted the loads on the sleds, redistributed supplies, and made sure the dogs received just enough food to keep their strength steady. His leadership was gentle but decisive, built on awareness rather than authority. On the 14th day, the wind returned with fierce intensity. Snow whipped across the ice in spiralling waves, erasing the horizon and turning each step into a battle against the storm. The team tightened their hoods, lowered their heads, and pressed on, barely able to see more than a few feet ahead. Wegener moved at the front, probing the ground, ensuring the sled stayed aligned. For hours the storm raged. The men's hands numbed, their eyelashes froze together. Several times they had to stop to clear ice from the dog's fur, preventing it from weighing them down. At last, when the wind eased, they set up camp behind a natural snow ridge, grateful for even the smallest shelter the land could offer. Inside the tent, Wegener wrote brief notes by the dim glow of a lantern. His handwriting was slower, the letters slightly uneven, but the habit of documenting remained steady. He recorded weather observations, distances travelled, and the condition of the group, not with the tone of complaint, but with the calm precision of a scientist who believed that every detail mattered. As night settled in, the temperature dropped even further. The men lay awake longer than usual, listening to the soft crackling of the ice beneath them. Wegener felt the strain in his own body, the stiffness in his fingers, the heaviness in his legs. Yet he also felt a quiet certainty forming. They were close. He could sense it not through calculation alone, but through the subtle familiarity of the landscape, the way the snow shaped itself, the tone of the wind. Ismita was no longer a distant goal. It was somewhere ahead, hidden beneath the frozen horizon, waiting for them. With that thought, Wegener closed his eyes, letting a rare moment of calm settle over him. Tomorrow, he told himself, they would push again, and tomorrow they might finally see the place they had fought so hard to reach. When morning arrived, the cold was sharper than anything the team had yet faced. The wind had calmed, but the temperature had plunged so low that the fabric of their tent felt stiff, almost brittle. Every breath stung. Every movement felt slowed by the weight of frost clinging to their clothing. Still, Wegener rose first, stepping outside into the pale, silent light. The dogs looked weak but alert, their breaths rising in slow clouds. He checked each one carefully before waking the men. Today mattered. He was certain they were approaching the final stretch toward Ismita. After a brief meal of frozen bread and coffee warmed just enough to drink, they packed the sleds and began moving again. The snow was dense, the ground uneven, but the visibility had improved. For the first time in many days, the horizon stretched clearly before them, a wide, white emptiness that carried a sense of direction rather than confusion. Wegener felt a spark of quiet optimism. The land here matched descriptions he had studied. Long, gentle rises, occasional ridges carved by ancient winds, and a faint slope leading toward the plateau where the inland station had been built. Yet the closer they came, the more exhausting the journey became. The ice rose steadily, creating a climb that drained both men and dogs. Progress slowed to a crawl. Sometimes they advanced only a few hundred meters in an hour. Still, they pressed on, driven not by speed but by necessity. Wegener walked at the front, pulling alongside the strongest dogs, leaning into the harness whenever the sleds grew stuck. His legs trembled from effort, but he ignored the discomfort. Every meter gained felt like a step towards safety, not for himself, but for the men waiting at ice meter. In the early afternoon, a faint shape appeared in the distance. At first it looked like nothing more than a dark smudge against the snow, but as they continued the outline sharpened. A post, then another, and then, barely visible, the low form of a wooden structure half buried by drifting snow. Ice meter. The sight filled the team with a quiet surge of relief. No one cheered. They were too tired, too cold, but hope flickered in their faces. The dogs pulled with renewed strength, sensing the shift in the men's energy. Finally, after weeks of hardship, they reached the station. The small cabin stood firm against the whiteness, smoke barely rising from its chimney. Wegener knocked on the ice-crusted door, and after a moment, Fritz Loh, one of the wintering scientists, opened it with visible astonishment. The men inside had been running dangerously low on supplies. Their relief at seeing Wegener and his team was immediate and profound. Inside, the cabin was dim and cramped, but warmer than anything the travellers had felt in days. They unloaded food, fuel, and essential gear, ensuring the station could survive the approaching winter darkness. The resupply had succeeded, but Wegener knew their work wasn't finished. They still had to return to West Station, and while their arrival brought comfort, the journey home would be even more perilous. As night settled over Eismeter, Wegener sat quietly by the small stove, thawing his frozen hands. For the first time in days he allowed himself a deep breath of relief. They had made it. But deep down he also sensed that the hardest decisions were still ahead. The warmth inside Eismeter was a welcome shock after the brutal cold of the ice sheet. The small stove glowed softly, filling the cramped cabin with a fragile sense of comfort. Wegener and his men thawed slowly, leaning close to the heat, feeling life return to their fingers. The wintering scientists, already pale and weakened from scarcity, thanked them repeatedly. The supplies had arrived just in time, yet despite the relief, concern lingered in the room. The men at Eismeter were now properly provisioned, but Wegener's team could not remain long. Their own rations were limited, and the inland station was too small to support so many people for an extended stay. They would have to return to West Station, and soon. Wegener knew this. He had expected it. Still, after nearly 2 weeks of exhausting travel, the thought of turning back into the cold weighed heavily on everyone. The wind outside howled against the wooden walls, a reminder that the Arctic winter was closing in faster each day. During the evening, Wegener met privately with Fritz Löwe and the others, discussing the safest plan for the return journey. The inland station would keep 2 of Wegener's men for rest, but Wegener and Willumsen would lead the trip back, taking a light load and moving quickly. It wasn't an easy choice, but it was practical. With fewer supplies and fewer men, the sleds would travel faster, reducing exposure to worsening conditions. That night, Wegener wrote his final entry in the Eismeter logbook before departing. His handwriting, though steady, showed signs of fatigue. Supplies delivered, men stable, begin return journey tomorrow. It was simple, almost understated, but it carried the weight of responsibility he felt deeply. The next morning, the temperature had fallen again. The cold pressed against the cabin walls like a living force. Wegener dressed slowly, layering every piece of warm clothing he had. Willumsen prepared the dogs, checking their paws and tightening the harnesses. The animals were exhausted but still responsive, loyal to the familiar commands. Before leaving, Wegener shook hands with each of the men staying behind. His expression was calm, reassuring, though tired. He knew the importance of showing confidence, not only for them, but for himself. Lover thanked him quietly, telling him that the station would survive because of this mission. Wegener nodded, accepting the words without pride, simply acknowledging the shared effort. When the moment came to depart, the sun sat low on the horizon, a faint circle of pale light barely visible through the haze. Wegener and Willumsen stepped onto the sled runners, gave a soft command, and the dogs began pulling away from the cabin that had sheltered them. The door closed behind them, and the small structure grew smaller in the distance. The wind picked up almost immediately, blowing loose snow across their path. Wegener looked ahead, reading the land with practiced eyes. He didn't speak much, neither did Willumsen. Words felt unnecessary in the face of the long journey home. Each mile would demand strength. Each hour would test their endurance. But Wegener remained steady, trusting in the same quiet determination that had brought them this far. Ice meter faded behind them, swallowed by the white expanse. Ahead lay the frozen world they had crossed before, unchanged, unforgiving, and waiting. The return journey began with a silence deeper than anything Wegener had felt on their way in. The wind, though calmer than before, carried a sharpness that hinted at storms forming beyond the horizon. Every instinct told him that winter was arriving faster than expected. Still, there was no choice but to move forward. The inland station could not spare more supplies, and West Station was the only safe destination left. The dogs pulled steadily at first, their paws crunching through the hardened snow. Wegener and Willumsen guided them along the familiar route, though the landscape looked different now. Snowdrifts had shifted. Ridges they had passed days earlier were buried or reshaped by the wind. Navigation required constant focus, and Wegener checked his compass regularly, ensuring they didn't drift off course. As the hours passed, the cold intensified. Even small tasks, tightening a strap, adjusting a harness, drinking a sip of melted snow, took longer than expected. Their breath froze instantly on their scarves. When they stopped to rest, the silence pressed around them like a physical weight. Wegener noted the signs of fatigue in the dogs. They moved slower, their breaths harsher. He whispered encouragement, patting their sides gently, knowing their strength was the lifeline of the entire journey. Willumsen balanced the sled loads, ensuring nothing dragged or shifted dangerously. He worked with a quiet efficiency that Wegener deeply appreciated. The two men communicated with minimal words, trusting each other completely. On the second day of travel, the weather shifted again. A thin haze settled across the sky, dulling the light. The wind grew unpredictable, blowing in sharp gusts that forced them to brace against the cold. Progress slowed as snow began drifting across their tracks, blurring the path behind them. By late afternoon, the temperature dropped further. Wegener felt the cold seeping into his hands despite his gloves. His movements became heavier, more deliberate. He knew they needed to stop soon, but the terrain offered little shelter. Eventually they found a shallow dip in the ice that provided slight protection from the wind. They pitched their small tent with stiff hands, securing it with long ice stakes. Inside, the warmth from their stove was minimal, but enough to keep them alive. They shared a quiet meal, each lost in his own thoughts. Wegener wrote a brief note in his pocket diary, his handwriting shaking from the cold. He recorded wind patterns and temperature as he always did, but he also wrote a line that revealed his awareness of the growing danger. Winter comes quicker than expected. That night the wind grew stronger, pushing against the tent walls with a low, steady pressure. The men slept lightly, waking often to check the stove or listen for changes in the storm. When dawn finally arrived, a faint pale glow barely visible through the canvas, they rose slowly, gathering their strength for another day. Outside the air was sharper than ever, The snow had hardened overnight, forming a crust that made walking easier but colder. Wegener stepped forward and looked across the vast white emptiness stretching toward the horizon. The distance to West Station was still long, but as always he felt a calm resolve settle within him. The only direction was forward, and forward he would go. The third day of their return began with a harsh, cutting wind that swept across the ice with unrelenting force. Wegener and Willemsen packed the tent in silence, their movements slow from the cold. Frost clung to their clothing the moment they stepped outside, forming thin crystals that shimmered faintly in the pale light. The dogs, though weary, responded to the familiar commands and began pulling the sleds forward. The surface of the ice had hardened overnight, creating a rough, uneven terrain. Each step felt heavier, each breath more difficult. Wegener kept checking the sky, watching for signs of an approaching storm. The clouds were thickening, spreading across the horizon in a grey sheet. He knew what that meant. Snowfall was coming, and likely the kind that erased all sense of direction. They continued on, leaning into the wind. The cold bit through layers of clothing, and even short pauses made their bodies ache. Still, Wegener's steady presence kept them moving. He walked beside the lead dogs, guiding them through rising drifts, always patient, always focused. The familiar landmarks they had used on their journey to Eismitte were now buried under new snow. What had once been gentle ridges were now smoothed into unbroken white stretches. Without clear reference points, the compass became their only reliable guide. Wegener checked it often, shielding it with his hands from the swirling snow. Around midday, the wind intensified. It pushed fiercely against their backs, forcing them to fight for balance. The dogs struggled, their paws sinking into newly formed drifts. Willemsen moved quickly between the sleds, adjusting straps and encouraging the team with quiet commands. The two men shared brief glances, no words necessary. They both understood how serious the situation was becoming. When the snowfall finally began, it was soft at first, then quickly thickened into a blinding curtain. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Wegener and Willemsen had to walk close together to avoid losing sight of each other in the storm. The dogs slowed, their heads low, pushing through the wind-driven flakes. The storm grew heavier each hour. Snow swirled wildly, filling the air with a constant roar. The men could only move slowly, one careful step at a time. Stopping wasn't an option. The cold would consume them. But moving forward meant navigating blindly, trusting the compass, trusting instinct. As the storm reached its peak, Wegener finally raised his hand, signalling that they needed shelter. They found a slight depression in the snow, barely enough to block the wind, and began setting up the tent with numb, shaking hands. The dogs huddled close, curling into tight shapes against the cold. Inside the small tent, the air was still freezing, but the thin fabric provided a fragile barrier against the storm. They lit the stove, though it struggled in the low temperature. Their meal was sparse, more nourishment in idea than reality, but it was enough to keep them moving. As Wegener wrote in his diary that evening, the ink froze on the pen tip several times. Still, he managed a few lines. Simple, factual, steady. Storm worsening, progress slow, must wait. The wind battered the tent throughout the night, shaking it violently. The men slept only in short intervals, listening for signs that the stakes might loosen or the fabric tear. When morning finally arrived, the storm had weakened, leaving dense silence in its wake. Wegener crawled out of the tent into a world reshaped by snow, softer, whiter, deeper. The path behind them was gone, but the compass still pointed forward, and forward they continued. When the storm finally released its grip, the world around Wegener and Willemsen had changed into something almost unrecognizable. The snow was deeper, softer, and drifted into long waves that hid the true shape of the ground beneath. The sky, though clearer, held a pale emptiness that offered little warmth. Still, the calm after the storm felt like a small blessing. They packed their tent, brushed frost from the dog's fur, and prepared to move again. The dogs were tired, struggling to find steady footing through the fresh snow. Wegener walked beside them, guiding the lead pair through the uneven terrain. He felt the cold more sharply now. Days of relentless exposure had seeped into his body, and even thick layers of clothing no longer offered the same protection. Yet his steps remained deliberate, steady. He understood that maintaining a calm pace was the only way to conserve energy and keep the dogs moving. Willemsen watched Wegener closely. He saw the strain in the older man's movements but said nothing. Their unspoken agreement was simple. Every bit of strength had to be saved for moving forward. By midday, a light wind returned, carrying fine flakes of snow that drifted across the surface like loose dust. It wasn't dangerous yet, but it hinted at more weather building somewhere far off. Wegener kept checking the sky and the compass. Their direction was true, but the landscape no longer showed any familiar features. The entire route had been erased by the storm. As they continued, the uneven snow made the sleds difficult to pull. The dogs strained, their breathing rough, their pace inconsistent. Wegener and Willemsen stepped into the harnesses beside them several times, helping the animals move the sleds over small rises. It was exhausting work, but necessary. Eventually they reached a stretch of harder ice where the snow was thinner. The dogs moved more easily, and for the first time that day, they covered a few kilometres without stopping. But the relief was brief. The temperature dropped sharply as evening approached, turning the air brittle. Wegener's hands stiffened whenever he removed his gloves, and even short tasks became difficult. As the light faded, they decided to make camp behind a low ridge that offered minimal shelter from the wind. Inside the tent, the warmth from the stove felt weaker than before. Their fuel was limited, and they needed to ration it carefully for the days ahead. They ate quietly, each man lost in his thoughts. Wegener felt an ache in his chest, not fear, but the weight of responsibility. He knew they were still far from West Station, and every hour of worsening weather increased the danger. Before sleeping, he wrote a short entry in his diary, the ink freezing at the tip again. Storm past, progress steady but slow, dogs weakening, must continue tomorrow. That night the temperature fell even lower. The tent creaked softly beneath the pressure of the cold. Wegener lay awake for a long time, listening to the muffled breathing of the dogs outside, feeling the fragile warmth of the stove fading. When morning came, he rose slowly, gathered his strength, and stepped into the frozen air. The world was silent once again, vast, white, and unforgiving, but the direction forward remained the same. The next morning brought a cold so intense it felt almost solid, as if the air itself resisted movement. Wegener stepped outside the tent slowly, his breath forming a dense cloud that hung in the stillness before fading into the pale light. The sky was clear, a muted blue stretched thin across the horizon. Clear skies meant one thing in the Arctic: deeper cold. He could feel it immediately, in his fingers, his legs, even in his lungs as he inhaled. Willemsen emerged a moment later, brushing frost from the tent fabric. The dogs stood close together, conserving warmth, lifting their paws occasionally to avoid direct contact with the ice. Wegener checked them gently, running his gloved hand along their sides. They were weak, but still willing, and willingness mattered now more than anything. After breaking camp, they began moving slowly. The snow had hardened overnight, forming a crust that cracked softly under their footsteps. At first, this helped the sled slide more easily, but the cold worked against them in other ways. The runners froze, the leather straps stiffened, and their breath turned to ice on their scarves almost instantly. The pace remained steady but slow. Each hour felt longer than the last. Wegener kept his eyes on the compass, adjusting their direction by small degrees. Without visible landmarks, the instrument was their only certainty. Willemsen walked behind the sled, watching for cracks or sudden dips in the ice. The silence was overwhelming. No wind, no sound, but the crunch beneath their boots and the steady panting of the dogs. It was the kind of silence that made the world feel impossibly large. By midday, Wegener felt the cold settling deeper into his body. His hands, even inside multiple layers, stiffened painfully. His feet numbed. He pushed through it, focusing on maintaining a smooth pace, knowing that stopping too often would only worsen their condition. The sun, weak and low, offered no warmth. Instead, it cast long blue shadows across the ice, distorting distances and depth. Several times Willemsen pointed out small dips that looked like flat ground from far away. The terrain was becoming trickier by the hour. As the afternoon faded, they realized the temperature was dropping even faster than expected. Wegener paused, looking at the dogs. Their heads hung lower now. Their breaths came in shorter bursts. Willemsen approached, his face tight with concern. They didn't need to speak to know what the other was thinking. They had to stop soon, or risk pushing the dogs too far. They found a shallow indentation in the ice, barely enough to shield them from the open air, and set up the tent. The fabric felt rigid as they unfolded it. Inside, the stove provided a small circle of warmth, but the cold pressed against them from all sides. They shared a simple meal in near silence. Even chewing felt slow. Wegener wrote another short entry in his diary, though his handwriting wavered. Extreme cold, dogs weakening, progress difficult. He didn't write more. His fingers could barely hold the pen. That night, as he lay in the tent, listening to the faint creaks of the ice beneath them, Wegener understood that each coming day would be harder, but he also knew they had no choice except to continue. Between them and West Station stretched a frozen world that cared nothing for effort or intention, and yet, with the same quiet resolve that had shaped his entire life, Wegener prepared himself for the next day, ready to face whatever the Arctic chose to give. Morning arrived without colour, without warmth, without even the faintest promise of relief. Wegener woke to the sound of the tent fabric cracking softly in the cold, a brittle reminder that the temperature had dropped even further overnight. His breath hovered in the air like smoke. He sat up slowly, his joints stiff, his hands numb despite layers of wool and fur. Willemsen stirred soon after. They exchanged a brief glance, tired, alert, determined. No words were needed. Outside, the dogs huddled tightly together, their fur frosted white, their bodies trembling lightly. Wegener knelt beside them, checking each one carefully. Their strength was fading, but their spirits had not yet broken. He whispered encouragement, patting their flanks gently before attaching them to the sleds. Everything took longer now. Straps had frozen hard. Metal buckles burned their fingers with cold. Even folding the tent felt like folding sheets of thin ice. Yet by mid-morning, they were moving again, pushing slowly across the frozen plain. The crusted snow made the sleds bump and shudder. Wegener walked ahead, scanning for changes in the terrain, adjusting their direction with a compass he kept close to his chest to prevent it from freezing. The sun, if it could be called that, hung low, dim, barely a suggestion of a light. Shadows stretched across the ice in long, wavering lines. The cold felt absolute. Each breath seared their lungs. Their eyelashes froze together. Their beards stiffened with frost. The dogs panted clouds of white vapour that formed halos around their heads. Still, they moved forward. For hours, the world around them remained identical, an endless sheet of white broken only by faint ripples of wind-carved snow. Wegener felt the exhaustion settling deeper. His steps grew heavier, slower, but he refused to stop. Each pause risked losing momentum, and momentum was the only thing keeping them from falling behind the deadly pace of winter. By early afternoon, the wind began to return, not violently, but with a slow, creeping persistence. It carried fine snow across the ice, forming thin veils that blurred the surface. Wegener felt it bite through his clothing, a sharp reminder that another storm could build at any time. Willemsen walked beside the sleds, watching the dogs carefully. 2 of them stumbled more than once, their legs buckling before they pushed themselves upright again. He fed them small pieces of pemmican during each short break, rubbing warmth into their paws. As the light faded, Wegener searched desperately for shelter. The land here was flat, offering almost nothing. Finally, they found a shallow ridge shaped by the wind, barely high enough to block a fraction of the cold, but it was their only option. Setting up camp was painfully slow. Their fingers barely obeyed commands. The stove, once lit, flickered weakly. Inside the tent, the air was only a few degrees warmer than outside. They ate slowly, forcing themselves to chew despite numb jaws. Wegener wrote a brief entry in his diary, though his hand shook badly. Cold worsening, limited shelter, dogs suffering. When he capped the pen, his fingers refused to straighten fully. That night, Wegener lay awake for long stretches, listening to the low, rising hum of wind outside. He felt the weight of the cold like a physical presence pressing into the tent. Sleep came in fragments, shallow and uneasy. By dawn, the temperature had dropped again, and Wegener knew, without calculation, without discussion, that the days ahead would test them more severely than anything they had faced so far. At dawn, the cold felt even sharper, sinking into Wegener's body with a depth that made movement painful. He forced himself to rise, knowing hesitation would only make the cold harder to fight. Outside, the wind had grown stronger overnight, shaping the snow into hard ridges and swirling patterns that made the landscape look foreign once again. The dogs struggled to stand. Their breaths came out in thin, exhausted puffs. Wegener stroked their fur gently, feeling how cold their bodies had become. Still, they wagged their tails weakly at the sound of his voice, a small reminder of their loyalty and determination. Willemsen emerged from the tent, his face pale, his steps slow. They exchanged a single look, weary but resolute, and began packing their gear. Their hands trembled as they tightened straps and checked the sled runners. The cold made even simple tasks feel like lifting heavy weights. Once they set off, the snow resisted them like a living force. The crust would break suddenly, sinking the sleds into softer layers beneath. The dogs strained, their legs shaking. Wegener moved constantly between leading them and helping push the sleds, each effort draining his remaining strength. The wind blew directly against them, slowing every step. Its icy breath cut through their clothing, numbing fingers and feet despite constant movement. Willemsen walked behind the sleds, correcting their course whenever drifting snow pulled them off path. Hours passed in near silence. Wegener's thoughts grew slow, fogged by the cold. He focused on the compass, on the steady rhythm of steps, on keeping the dogs moving. Every small break was brief, just enough to breathe and continue. By midday, the sky dimmed again. Snowflakes appeared in the air, drifting sideways in the rising wind. A storm was forming. Wegener felt it instantly. That subtle shift in pressure, that tightening of the air that he knew better than most men alive. They pressed on as long as possible, but by mid-afternoon the wind became too strong to fight. Wegener raised his arms, signalling to stop. They found no true shelter. The landscape was flat, unforgiving. Finally, they chose the leeward side of a small snowdrift, barely a ridge, but enough to soften the wind slightly. Pitching the tent was a desperate, clumsy effort. The fabric whipped violently in the wind. Their hands were nearly numb, and the stakes had to be hammered through ice harder than stone. Inside, the stove flickered weakly, unable to push back the cold entirely. Their breath filled the cramped space with a mist that froze on the canvas walls. They ate a small meal in silence, both knowing their fuel and food were running low. Wegener wrote a short entry in his diary, each letter stiff. Storm coming, strength fading, must keep going. As night fell, the storm grew louder. The tent shuddered beneath the force of the wind. Outside, the world vanished into white. Wegener lay awake, listening to the Arctic roar, feeling the cold creep deeper into his bones. He knew the next day would be critical, perhaps the hardest one yet. Morning came, but it brought no relief. The storm had eased only slightly, leaving behind a world reshaped by wind and snow. Wegener stepped out of the tent into a silence so heavy it felt unreal. The sky was pale and flat, the light thin as if filtered through ice. The snow beneath his boots had hardened into rough, uneven crusts that cracked sharply with each step. Willemsen joined him, brushing frost from his beard, his movements stiff. No words were spoken. Both men understood what the day demanded. They were running out of time, out of fuel, out of strength. The only way to survive was to keep moving toward West Station. The dogs rose slowly, their legs trembling from exhaustion. Wegener whispered to them, touching each one on the neck, thanking them for their endurance. He felt the weight of responsibility for them just as strongly as he did for the success of the mission. Packing the sleds took longer than usual. Straps had frozen solid, and their fingers lacked the warmth and flexibility to work quickly. The cold cut through their gloves like thin paper. Still, with patient, deliberate motions, they managed to get everything secured. When they finally set off, the wind pressed lightly against them, not enough to halt progress, but enough to remind them that another storm could rise without warning. The snow was uneven, forming alternating patches of soft drifts and hard, icy ridges. The sleds jolted constantly, and the dogs fought to maintain balance. Wegener walked beside the lead sled, leaning his weight forward, pulling when the terrain became too difficult for the animals alone. Each step felt heavier than the last. Willemsen walked behind, steadying the load, occasionally calling out warnings when the ground looked unstable. Several times they encountered snowfields so soft that the sled sank almost immediately. They had to unload part of their cargo, drag the sleds through, and then carry the supplies by hand before repacking everything again. Every one of those sequences drained enormous amounts of energy. By midday, the light grew dim again, though the sun was still above the horizon. Clouds moved in, thickening slowly, hinting at more difficult weather ahead. Wegener checked the compass repeatedly. The land showed no familiar features, only an endless, rolling plain of white. He felt the cold creeping deeper into his arms and legs, making movement difficult. Still, he pressed forward. The dogs slowed. Their breaths came in harsh bursts. Wegener and Willemsen paused briefly to give them small rations. Even the act of chewing seemed exhausting for the animals. By late afternoon, exhaustion overtook Wegener more strongly than before. His vision blurred at the edges, and he felt a strange heaviness in his limbs. Willemsen noticed and took on more of the pulling without being asked. The two men continued their silent struggle across the ice, step after step, breath after breath. When the light finally began to fade, Wegener called for them to stop. There was no real shelter, just a slight dip in the snow that offered the faintest break from the wind. They set up the tent with shaking hands, the fabric stiff and uncooperative. Inside, the air warmed only slightly from the weak stove. They shared a small rationed meal, each movement careful and slow. Wegener wrote a short entry in his diary, the letters uneven. Progress minimal. Dogs exhausted. Storm possible. That night the cold felt heavier than ever, settling deep into the fabric of the tent and the bones of the men inside. Wegener lay awake, aware that their strength was fading, but equally aware that stopping was not an option. Tomorrow they would rise again, and tomorrow they would try once more to reach the safety that still lay far ahead across the frozen world. The next morning arrived with a dim, bluish light that barely touched the horizon. Wegener woke, feeling as if the cold had settled inside his bones overnight. Every movement required effort. Even lifting his arm to unzip his sleeping bag felt strangely heavy. Willemsen stirred silently beside him, equally exhausted. Outside, the world had quieted again after the brief storm. The snow lay smooth and pale, untouched except for the faint traces of their arrival the evening before. The silence was immense, the kind that made the ice feel endless. The dogs rose slowly when they heard the men emerge. Their breaths came out in thick clouds, their limbs stiff. Wegener knelt beside them, checking their paws and offering gentle words of reassurance. They were as worn as the men, yet they still pressed their noses against his gloved hands, ready to continue. After breaking camp, a slow, painful process in the deepening cold, they began moving again. The snow was firmer today, but the surface was uneven, marked by long ridges shaped by the shifting wind. Each ridge forced the sleds to jolt sharply, draining the dogs' remaining strength. Wegener leaned heavily into the harness beside them, pulling as much by hand as the animals pulled by instinct. The air felt sharper than the day before. The cold gnawed at exposed skin instantly. Their breaths froze on their scarves in thick layers that had to be broken off every so often. Willemsen's steps were steady but slow, his face pale beneath the frost. They communicated with only the simplest gestures now, a raised hand to stop, a nod to continue. Midway through the day, a thin haze began spreading across the sky. Wegener paused, studying it with growing concern. He recognized the sign: falling temperatures, building pressure, the subtle warning of another approaching storm. They needed to move as far as possible before it arrived, but despite their determination, their pace had become painfully slow. The dogs stumbled more frequently, and Wegener's legs felt heavier with each passing hour. His fatigue was no longer just physical. It was creeping into his thoughts, dulling his focus, making each decision slightly harder. By late afternoon, the wind shifted again, blowing snow across the surface in thin, swirling lines. Visibility dropped just enough to make the horizon blur. Wegener knew they needed to camp soon, before the storm fully formed. They found a shallow dip in the ice, barely a shelter, but the only option. Setting up the tent was more difficult than ever. The fabric felt stiff, almost frozen. Their fingers barely managed the knots and stakes. Inside, the stove produced only a weak warmth. They rationed a small meal, sharing more with the dogs than with themselves. Wegener took out his diary. His hand trembled so much he struggled to write, but he managed a few uneven words. Cold worsening, strength low, must continue tomorrow. Afterward he let the pen fall from his fingers. As night settled in, the wind outside grew louder, brushing against the tent with rising force. Wegener lay awake, staring into the dimness, feeling the exhaustion sink deeper into his limbs. He knew they had reached the edge of their endurance, but he also knew the only path left was forward, across the frozen miles still standing between them and safety. When Wegener opened his eyes the next morning, he felt the cold before he felt anything else. It wrapped around him like a heavy weight, pressing into his chest and slowing every breath. His hands were stiff, his legs numb, and even turning his head required effort. For a moment he remained still, listening to the faint rustle of the tent in the wind. He knew immediately that the temperature had dropped again. Willemsen woke shortly after, his movements slow and deliberate. Neither man spoke. Words would have been wasted in the fragile warmth of the tent. Outside, the sky was a pale, expressionless grey. Snow drifted lightly across the surface, pushed by a soft but persistent wind. The storm had not fully arrived, but its presence hung in the air like a warning. Wegener stepped out first, steadying himself against the cold. The dogs lifted their heads weakly when they saw him. Their bodies trembled from exhaustion, but their eyes remained alert, loyal. He ran his gloved hand along their fur, feeling how cold they had become. After packing the tent, a difficult task with fingers that barely obeyed, they began moving again. The snow beneath them was softer today, as if the thin layer of drifting flakes masked deeper, unstable ground. Each step felt uncertain. The sled sank more often, forcing Wegener and Willemsen to lift and push. burning through their remaining strength. The wind gradually increased, carrying fine crystals of snow that stung their faces. Wegener leaned forward, watching the compass closely. He knew that even a small deviation could lead them dangerously off course. Their progress was slow, painfully slow. The dogs stumbled frequently, their legs shaking. Willemsen paused often to help them regain footing. The silence between the men was not empty. It was focused, determined. Speaking felt unnecessary. All that mattered was the steady rhythm of moving forward. But by midday, the wind strengthened, pushing against their bodies with enough force to make balance difficult. Snow swirled around them in thin spirals. The horizon disappeared behind a curtain of white. Wegener felt his strength fading faster than before. His steps grew unsteady, and he found himself leaning more heavily against the sled. Willemsen noticed and moved closer, ready to take over whenever Wegener faltered. The dogs slowed almost to a crawl. Their breaths came in short, uneven bursts. Wegener knelt beside them, whispering reassurance, offering the last of their small rations. The animals ate slowly, their movements sluggish. As the afternoon dimmed, Wegener knew they had to stop. Continuing in this condition, with the wind rising and visibility shrinking, would put them all at greater risk. They found a small slope shaped by the wind, offering the slightest shelter. Setting up camp drained their final reserves. The tent shook violently as they secured it. Inside, the stove flickered weakly, barely warming the icy air. Wegener wrote in his diary, though his vision blurred and his hand shook, "Very weak. Dogs exhausted. Storm coming." When he finished, his eyelids felt heavy, his breathing slow. Willemsen watched him with concern, but Wegener managed a faint, reassuring nod. Outside, the wind gathered strength, brushing the tent with icy fingers. Inside, exhaustion settled over the two men like a second layer of snow. Tomorrow would demand everything they had left, and they both knew it. The storm deepened through the night, its voice a constant low roar against the thin walls of the tent. When Wegener finally stirred, the dim morning light filtered weakly through the canvas, giving everything a pale, muted glow. His body felt heavier than ever. Even lifting himself to a sitting position took effort. The cold had crept into every joint, every muscle. Outside, the wind had slowed but not calmed. The air was sharp, biting, filled with drifting flakes that moved like fine dust across the open ice. Willemsen stepped out first, securing the tent flaps against the wind. He glanced back at Wegener, concern etched in his frost-covered face. Wegener forced a reassuring nod, though he felt his strength slipping deeper with each breath. The dogs rose slowly when they heard the familiar preparations. Their bodies trembled, their steps unsteady. Wegener knelt beside them, checking their harnesses with stiff, half-numb hands. He whispered softly, knowing that their endurance was the last fragile line keeping the mission alive. Breaking camp took longer than ever. The tent fabric felt like stiff wood, and every knot had frozen solid overnight. Their fingers were clumsy from the cold, refusing to move quickly. Still, with patience and deliberate focus, they managed to pack everything. When they finally began moving again, the snow beneath them gave way with an unsettling softness. The storm had reshaped the landscape completely. Smooth surfaces had turned into hidden hollows, and the sleds dipped into them unpredictably. The dogs struggled to pull through the uneven ground. Wegener walked beside them, leaning heavily on the sled for balance. His breath came in slow, laboured bursts, crystallizing instantly in the air. Each step took more effort than the last. The horizon was barely visible, blurred by drifting snow and the lingering haze of the storm. Willemsen stayed close, guiding the rear sled, watching Wegener carefully. He could see the older man's movements faltering, his balance weaker. But Wegener pressed on, driven by a quiet, unwavering determination that had carried him through every hardship of his life. By midday, the wind picked up again, pushing against them in steady waves. The cold felt sharper, cutting through layers of clothing as if they were thin cloth. Wegener paused, leaning on the sled, his breath shallow. Willemsen approached quickly, steadying him with a gloved hand. They exchanged no words. There was no need. Both understood how fragile their situation had become. Yet stopping wasn't an option. The dogs needed warmth. The men needed distance. The only way to survive was to continue moving, even when their bodies protested with each step. They marched on, their pace painfully slow. Shadows stretched across the snow as the light shifted, dimming earlier than the day before. Wegener felt a wave of dizziness pass through him. He steadied himself, pulled in a deep breath, and kept going. When the day grew too dark to continue, they set up camp again behind a small ridge. The tent rattled in the wind as they secured it with the last of their strength. Inside, the stove flickered weakly, barely warming the air. Wegener sank onto his sleeping bag, his chest rising and falling slowly, his eyes heavy. He reached for his diary, but his hand trembled too much to write. Willemsen watched silently, worry settling into his features. As Wegener closed his eyes, the cold pressed against the tent, reminding them that the Arctic had no mercy left to spare. And tomorrow they would have to rise and face it again. When morning arrived, it came without warmth, without colour, without even the faintest sense of time passing. Wegener opened his eyes slowly, feeling the weight of the cold inside his chest before anything else. The weakness that had crept in the day before now settled heavily over him. Even sitting upright felt like lifting a great burden. Willemsen moved quietly around the tent, his breath visible in thick clouds as he checked their supplies. His concern for Wegener was obvious, though he kept his movement steady, respectful, determined. Outside, the wind blew softly but constantly, shaping the snow into smooth lines and small ridges. The world felt drained of sound. The sky was a pale sheet of grey, offering neither guidance nor comfort. When Wegener stepped outside, leaning on the sled for balance, the air bit sharply against his face. The dogs looked up at him with tired eyes. Their bodies were thin, their movements stiff, but they rose obediently as he approached. He checked their harnesses slowly, his fingers clumsy from the cold, whispering his usual soft encouragements. Today, every moment mattered. They packed the tent in silence, both men moving with slow, deliberate care. When they finally set off, the sleds creaked over the uneven snow. The dogs strained forward, their paws sinking into hidden pockets of softness beneath the crust. Wegener walked beside them, but his steps were unsteady. Several times he paused to catch his breath, leaning heavily on the sled rails. Willemsen watched him closely, adjusting their pace when needed. The landscape stretched endlessly around them, flat, white, indifferent. The sky and the ground blended at the edges, creating a world that felt both vast and empty. Despite the cold and exhaustion, they pushed forward. The compass remained their only guide, the thin needle trembling in the freezing air. By midday, Wegener's strength had noticeably faded. His legs trembled more often, and he stumbled once, catching himself on the sled. Willemsen rushed to steady him, their eyes meeting for a brief moment, a silent acknowledgement that time was running out. Wegener, breathing slowly, nodded for them to continue. The dogs slowed further as the day wore on. Each step seemed to cost them more than the last. Still they pressed forward, driven by instinct and loyalty. The light began to dim early again, turning the ice into shifting shadows. Willemsen suggested they stop, but Wegener shook his head faintly. He wanted, needed, to cover just a little more distance before resting. They continued for another hour, maybe less. The cold made time impossible to measure. Finally, when the sky darkened into a deep blue, they made camp behind a shallow rise. Setting up the tent drained the last of their strength. Inside, the stove flickered weakly, barely warming the air. Willemsen handed Wegener a small portion of food, but Wegener's hands shook too much to hold it. After a moment he managed a slow breath and whispered, "Tomorrow, we continue." It was barely audible, but Willemsen heard it. He nodded, though the worry on his face deepened. Outside, the Arctic wind curled around the tent, pressing gently, almost thoughtfully, against the thin fabric. Inside, Wegener closed his eyes, feeling the cold settle deeper, knowing the next day would demand more strength than his body felt capable of giving, yet still quietly resolved to keep moving forward. Dawn came slowly, as if reluctant to return to a world so deeply frozen. Wegener woke with a start, not from noise, but from the sudden awareness that his body felt heavier than the blankets covering him. The cold had sunk into him completely now, settling in his chest, his arms, his legs. His breath came in shallow waves, each inhale a reminder of how thin the air felt inside the tent. Willemsen crouched beside the stove, his hands trembling as he coaxed the weak flame to life. When he turned, his eyes filled with worry the moment he saw Wegener sitting upright with effort. Still, Wegener managed a faint smile, tired but determined. Outside, the wind had calmed again, but the cold was sharper than ever. The horizon was washed in pale grey, the snow reflecting a dim, ghostly light that made everything appear motionless. The dogs stood slowly, shaking frost from their fur. They were visibly weakened, but still responsive to the familiar preparations. Wegener moved among them, though each step felt like walking through deep water. He checked their harnesses, whispering soft encouragement, though his voice was faint, nearly swallowed by the air. Packing camp took nearly twice as long as usual. Wegener's hands barely obeyed him. Willemsen had to step in often, tightening straps, securing ropes. When they finally set off, the sleds creaked over the hardened snow, the sound sharp in the quiet morning. Wegener walked beside the lead dogs, but his steps were uneven. Several times he stumbled, catching himself only with the help of the sled rails. Willemsen kept close, ready to steady him whenever needed. The world around them stretched into an endless pale sheet. No landmarks broke the horizon. Nothing hinted at how far West Station remained. The compass needle quivered, its direction steady but offering no comfort. As hours passed, Wegener's pace slowed further. His breath turned shallow, each exhale forming brittle crystals that clung to his scarf. The dogs strained forward, their strength nearly spent. Willemsen called for brief pauses, allowing the animals to rest, but Wegener urged them to keep going. His eyes held a quiet urgency, a recognition that stopping too long might mean they never rise again. By late afternoon, Wegener faltered. His legs stiffened, buckling beneath him. Willemsen hurried to support him, helping him lean against the sled. Wegener nodded, signalling he just needed a moment. But even as he rested, Willemsen saw the truth. The older man's strength was failing in a way the cold alone could not explain. Still, Wegener insisted on rising, gripping the sled tightly as he stood. "Forward," he whispered, his voice barely audible. They continued, but much slower. The light began to fade early, turning the landscape into a soft blur of shadows and snow. When Wegener stumbled again, harder this time, almost collapsing, Willemsen made the decision. They needed to stop. He guided them toward a small drift shaped by the wind, offering minimal shelter, but enough to pitch the tent. Inside, Wegener sank onto his sleeping bag, his body trembling with exhaustion. Willemsen lit the stove, fed the dogs, and wrapped extra blankets around him. Wegener's breathing slowed, though his eyes remained open. He managed a faint, reassuring look, as if to say he was still with him, still determined. Outside, the Arctic night settled over them, silent, vast, indifferent, as Willemsen watched over Wegener, knowing the coming hours would decide everything. Wegener woke in the dimness of early morning, though the light outside was so faint it was difficult to tell whether day had truly begun. His breath came slowly, each inhale thin and fragile. The cold inside the tent felt heavier than ever, not the sharp bite of wind, but a deep settling chill that clung to everything it touched. Willemsen was already awake, sitting close to the small stove trying to coax a flame from what little fuel remained. His hands shook as he worked, not from fear, but from the cold that had soaked into his bones after so many days on the ice. When he turned to Wegener, his face tightened with worry. Wegener looked weaker than the night before, his eyes dimmer, his movements slower, his breath shallow. Still, when their eyes met, Wegener managed a faint smile. A small gesture, but one filled with quiet resolve. Outside, the world was unnervingly still. The wind had died completely, leaving behind a frozen silence that stretched across the ice in all directions. The sky was a pale grey, barely distinguishable from the ground. The dogs stood close together, conserving the last of their strength. Their breaths formed faint clouds in the cold air. Wegener rose with great effort. Willemsen helped him to his feet, steadying him until he found his balance. Though his body was weak, Wegener's gaze held the same calm determination that had carried him through every hardship of the expedition. He placed a gloved hand on the lead dog's head, offering a slow, gentle pat. Then he whispered, "We continue." Packing the tent took nearly all their strength. The canvas was stiff, the ropes frozen hard. Wegener worked beside Willemsen, though every motion cost him energy he didn't have to spare. His hands trembled, and several times he paused, leaning on the sled to steady himself. Still, he helped as much as he could, not because he needed to prove anything, but because he believed deeply in finishing what they had begun. When they finally set off, the sleds moved slowly across the hardened snow. Wegener walked beside them at first, but his steps were unsteady. Several times he stumbled, catching himself with difficulty. Willemsen watched closely, staying near enough to help at any moment. The world around them seemed unchanged, a single, endless sheet of white. But Wegener felt the distance in his body. Each step drained him further. Each breath felt shallower. Hours passed quietly. The dogs struggled but continued, driven by instinct and loyalty. The compass needle remained steady, guiding them across the barren landscape. But the cold pressed harder with each passing moment. Near midday, Wegener faltered again. His legs buckled beneath him, and this time he could not stand immediately. Willemsen rushed to support him, helping him lean against the sled. Wegener's eyes flickered open, calm but tired. He whispered something, too soft to hear at first. Willemsen leaned closer. Wegener repeated it, voice faint. "Don't stop." He tried to rise again but lacked the strength. Willemsen held him, steadying him as the wind began to pick up once more. In that fragile moment, Wegener looked out across the frozen expanse, the place he had studied, loved, and dedicated his life to understanding. His breath formed one more soft cloud in the cold air. Then he closed his eyes, his body settling into stillness. Willemsen called his name, shaking him gently. But Wegener did not respond. The Arctic, vast and silent, held him in its frozen embrace, as if acknowledging the man who had spent his life listening to its quiet truths. Willemsen knelt beside him, the cold wind rising just enough to stir the snow, carrying the moment into the endless white. For a long moment, Willemsen knelt beside Wegener, the cold pressing against him from every direction. The wind brushed lightly across the snow, carrying with it a silence that felt impossibly heavy. Wegener lay still, his face peaceful, as if simply resting after the long journey. But Willemsen knew. The exhaustion, the cold, the endless miles had finally taken their toll. There, beneath the wide, indifferent Arctic sky, Alfred Wegener's journey had ended. Yet though grief struck him, Willemsen had no time to collapse beneath its weight. The dogs shivered. The temperatures continued to fall, and the last stretch of the journey still separated them from West Station. He understood immediately that his next decisions mattered not just for himself, but for the memory of the man he had travelled beside, and for the team still waiting for news. Carefully, with numb hands, he secured Wegener's body in the sled, wrapping him as best he could to protect him from the wind. It was a painful task, but he did it with respect, aware that this was the only gesture left he could offer. The dogs watched quietly, their ears drooping, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. Willumsen whispered to them softly, gathering the last of their strength. Then, with a deep, steady breath, he began the final part of the journey. The wind rose slightly as they moved forward, pushing at his back like a cold reminder that time was short. Willumsen kept his eyes on the compass, guiding the sled with determination. Every step he took felt heavy, his body drained, but he urged himself onward. The routines Wegener had instilled, slow breathing, measured steps, calm focus, stayed with him now, offering the guidance he needed. The landscape stretched endlessly, but Willumsen pressed forward, motivated by duty and memory. Each hour blurred into the next. He stopped only briefly to rest the dogs, then continued, his hands stiff, his body aching. As daylight faded into pale blue dusk, he finally spotted familiar shapes on the horizon. The low structures of West Station, half buried in snow. Relief washed over him so strongly he nearly lost his balance. The dogs, sensing the end near, found a final surge of strength. When Willumsen reached the station, the men there rushed out, their faces filled with shock and sorrow as they saw who he carried. They helped lift Wegener's body gently, bringing him inside out of the cold. The room grew quiet as the truth settled in. Wegener had given everything, his strength, his resolve, even his life, to ensure the success of the mission and the survival of the men at Ice Meter. In the days that followed, a storm swept across the ice. The team honoured his memory in the only way possible, by continuing the expedition's work with the same determination and integrity he had always shown. Years later, the full significance of Wegener's scientific contributions would be recognised. Continental drift, once dismissed, became the foundation for modern geology. His theory, shaped by patience, observation and quiet conviction, changed the way humanity understood the Earth, and though he never lived to see it accepted, the truth he devoted his life to eventually found its place. In the end, Alfred Wegener's legacy was not only in the theory that moved continents, but in the spirit with which he pursued it, calm, persistent and unwavering, even across the frozen heart of the Arctic,